Tonight, we escape into the shadows for another sleep story edition of Steamy Stories After Dark, marked by midnight. If you find yourself captivated by my stories, share the secret with a friend. Please subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications, to join our community, and if you like, leave a comment to share what you think of the series and what time it is and what part of the world you are listening. It is nice to see the reach this series is getting. Settle in. The journey starts now. Seat 1. The Coronation of Shadows. 1. The silence after the storm. The dust of Arkenfall didn't settle. It hovered in the air like a shroud, shimmering with the dying embers of the silver fire I had unleashed. I stood in the center of the ruined sanctum, my breath hitching in my chest, my lungs burning with the scent of ozone and ancient stone. The power, Kade's power, was still humming beneath my skin, a low rhythmic vibration that felt like a second heartbeat. But it was different now. It was colder, heavier. The silver light that had once felt like a summer sun was now streaked with veins of obsidian, a gift from the Patriarch that I hadn't asked for. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. Fine lines of black ink were crawling up my fingers, tracing the paths of my veins like a map of a country I didn't recognize. Elara? The voice was a ghost, a ragged rasp that barely carried across the debris. I spun around, my boots crunching on the shattered remains of the obsidian altar. Kade was struggling to sit up, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His skin was the color of winter moonlight, and the mercury silver of his eyes was dim, flickering like a candle in a drafty room. Kade! I scrambled toward him, my knees hitting the stone with a jarring thud. I reached for him, my fingers brushing his cheek, and he flinched, not in fear, but in shock. Your touch, he whispered, his hand coming up to cover mine, his fingers icy cold. It's different. It's not just mine anymore. I pulled my hand back, staring at the black ink on my skin. Your father. He did something to the mark, Kade. He turned it. He said I was a vessel. He said the transition had begun. Kade's jaw tightened, a flash of the old lethal fire returning to his eyes for a fleeting second. He looked past me, toward the shadows where the Patriarch had vanished, and then back at the ruined hall. The enforcers were gone, either dead or fled into the bowels of the academy. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, mournful tolling of the cracked great bell. He's gone, Kade said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. For now. He doesn't want to kill us, Elara. He wants to watch us. He wants to see if the seed he planted in you will take root. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, his touch lingering with a possessive, desperate heat. But he underestimated one thing, Kade growled, pulling me closer until our foreheads touched, just as they had during the power exchange. He thinks he can control the weapon he forged. He doesn't realize that the weapon has a soul of its own, and that soul belongs to me. 2. The Walk of the Sovereign. We didn't leave the sanctum as fugitives. We left as sovereigns. Kade leaned on me at first, his weight heavy and solid against my side. But as we climbed the winding stone stairs toward the surface, the magic began to circulate between us again. It was a dark, turbulent cycle, silver fire meeting black ink, but it was working. With every step, his strength returned, his posture straightening, his shoulders broadening until he looked once again like the heir of the most powerful house in the world. We emerged into the great hall of Arkenfall just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. The sight was breathtaking in its destruction. The massive stained glass windows had been blown outward, leaving jagged frames that looked like the teeth of a giant. The morning light poured in, cold and unforgiving, illuminating the hundreds of students who were gathered in the hall. They were silent. Scholarship students, elite heirs, professors, and servants, they were all there, standing among the glass shards and the fallen tapestries. They looked at us with a mixture of terror and awe. They saw the soot on our skin, the blood on our clothes, and the way the air seemed to warp around us. But mostly, they looked at their own wrists. The marks were gone. The violet tethers that had bound them to the Council's will for centuries had vanished, replaced by faint silvery scars that would eventually fade into nothing. "The Council is dead," Kade's voice rang out, echoing through the hollowed-out hall. It wasn't a shout, it was a statement of fact, a vibration that seemed to settle into the very stones of the academy. He stepped away from me, standing in the center of the hall, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. "The Dean is gone. The enforcers have been disbanded. The wards that held you here, that treated you like cattle for the high courts, have been shattered." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound of disbelief, of hope, of 1,000 lives suddenly realizing they were free. "But do not mistake freedom for safety," Kade continued, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, lingering on the elite heirs who were already looking for a new master to serve. "The world outside these walls is still ruled by the old blood. My father is still out there. The high courts will not let Arkenfall fall without a fight." He turned back to me, reaching out his hand. I walked toward him, my heart hammering against my ribs, the black ink on my skin shimmering in the morning light. "Arkenfall is no longer a school," Kade said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that seemed to speak directly to every soul in the room. "It is a fortress, and from this day forward, it belongs to the market." He took my hand, lifting it high so everyone could see the silver and black lines of our shared bond. "Behold your queen," he whispered, the words carrying a weight that made the students fall to their knees, one by one, until the great hall was a sea of bowed heads. I looked at Kade, and for the first time, I didn't see the boy who had claimed me in the library. I saw a king, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of the woman I had become, a woman who was no longer afraid of the dark, because she had become the darkness itself. 3. The burning of the records. "We can't leave them, Kade. Not like this." We were in the registrar's office, a room filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound ledgers. These were the life books, the records of every student who had ever passed through Arkenfall. They contained every secret, every weakness, every debt that the Council had used to keep the scholarship students in line. Kade stood by the window, watching the students in the courtyard below. They were burning their uniforms, the gray wool fueling a massive bonfire that sent plumes of black smoke into the sky. "They are just paper, Elara," he said, his voice distant. "No," I said, pulling a ledger from the shelf. I opened it to my own name. Elara, Vance. Origin, Sector 4. Potential, high. Utility, disposable. They're chains. As long as these books exist, the Council, or your father, can find them. They can find their families. They can pull them back into the dark. Kade turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the book in my hand. He walked toward me, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He took the ledger from my hands, his fingers brushing mine, and I felt a jolt of that new, dark energy pass between us. "You're right," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips. "We don't just break the walls. We erase the history." He raised his hand, and a spark of silver fire danced on his fingertips. But as I watched, the fire didn't stay silver. It turned a deep, bruised violet, then a shimmering, oily black. "The Patriarch's gift," Kade whispered, a dark smile playing on his lips. "Let's see what it can do." He touched the spark to the ledger. The fire didn't burn like normal flame. It didn't crackle or smoke. It consumed. The paper didn't turn to ash. It simply vanished, dissolved into a fine black mist that smelled of old memories and forgotten dreams. The fire spread rapidly, jumping from ledger to ledger, shelf to shelf. Within seconds, the entire room was a vortex of black flame. It was beautiful and terrifying, a silent execution of the past. Kade pulled me back toward the door as the heat began to rise. We stood in the hallway, watching through the glass as centuries of secrets were erased in a matter of minutes. "It's done," I whispered, feeling a strange lightness in my chest, as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had finally been lifted. "Not quite," Kade said, his hand sliding down to my waist, pulling me flush against him. "There is one more record we need to deal with." He led me down the hall to the headmaster's private study. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and old malice. On the desk sat a single small box made of white bone. "The master key?" I asked. "Better," Kade said. He opened the box. Inside was a single glowing crystal, the heart of Arkenfall. It was the anchor for all the wards, the source of the power that had kept the academy hidden and protected for 1,000 years. "If we break this," I said, my voice trembling, "the academy will be visible to the world. Your father will know exactly where we are." "He already knows," Kade said, his eyes fixed on the crystal. "But if we keep it, he can use it to bypass our defenses. He can walk through the front gates whenever he chooses." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you trust me, Elara?" "With my life," I said without hesitation. "Then help me," he said. We both reached for the crystal. As our fingers touched the glowing surface, the magic within us surged. The silver and the black, the light and the dark, they merged into a single devastating force. The crystal didn't break, it exploded. A wave of energy blasted outward, a silent roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain. I felt the wards snap, the invisible dome over the academy shattering like a glass bowl. For a moment, the world was white. When my vision cleared, the crystal was gone. The room was silent. And through the window, I could see the horizon. For the first time in the history of Arkenfall, the mountains didn't look like a prison. They looked like a frontier. "We are exposed," I whispered, leaning my head against Kade's shoulder. "No," Kade said, his arm tightening around me, his voice a low, possessive promise. "We are finally awake." 4. The Shadow in the Master Suite. The Master Suite of Arkenfall was a place of legends. It sat at the very apex of the highest spire, a circular chamber of black marble and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the jagged peaks of the mountain range. For centuries, had been the seat of the headmaster, the throne room of the council's puppet. Now the doors lay shattered on the floor, and the air inside smelled of cold ash and expensive bitter wine. Kade walked to the center of the room, his boots clicking with a rhythmic, predatory precision against the marble. He didn't look like a student anymore. He didn't even look like the boy who had fought for me in the Sanctum. He looked like a king returning to a palace he had burned to the ground. "He's here?" Kade said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in the very glass of the windows. I stood by the threshold, my hand resting on the cold stone of the doorframe. The black ink on my skin was pulsing, a slow, rhythmic throb that mirrored the heartbeat of the mountain itself. I could feel the darkness Kade's father had planted in me. It was cold, like a sliver of ice lodged in my marrow, and it was reaching for the silver fire Kade had given me. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadows in the far corner of the room didn't move, but they seemed to deepen, to become more solid. And then a man stepped out of the gloom. The Patriarch of the Valen house didn't wear armor. He didn't carry a weapon. He wore a simple high-collared coat of midnight blue, so dark it was almost black, and a single ring of heavy, unpolished iron on his right hand. His hair was the color of a winter storm, and his eyes, those mercury silver pits, held a cold, terrifying intelligence that made my blood turn to lead. "You've made quite a mess of my school, Kade," the Patriarch said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that seemed to press down on my shoulders, forcing the air from my lungs. Kade didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his silver eyes clashing with his father's in a silent, invisible war of wills. "It was never your school, father. It was a cage, and I've broken the bars." The Patriarch smiled, a thin, mirthless line that didn't reach his eyes. He turned his gaze toward me, and I felt a physical jolt of cold pass through my body. "And the little scholarship student?" he murmured, his voice like the sliding of a grave marker. "The vacuum that became a vessel. Tell me, Elara, how does it feel to carry the weight of 1,000 years of Valen blood in your veins? Does it burn? Or does it simply consume?" I stepped forward, my chin lifting, my hands glowing with a mixture of silver and blacklight. "It feels like justice," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It feels like the end of your reign." The Patriarch laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Justice? Justice is a word for the weak, child. Power is the only truth in this world. And you are the most powerful thing I have ever created." He walked toward us, the ground freezing beneath his boots, a trail of white frost spreading across the black marble like a spider web. "Kade thinks he saved you," the Patriarch said, his eyes never leaving mine. "He thinks he gave you his magic out of love, but he only did what I intended. He tempered the blade, he filled the vessel, and now I am here to claim the prize." 5. The Battle of Wills. The air in the room suddenly turned to ice. Kade moved before I could even blink. He threw himself between me and his father, a wall of silver fire erupting from his skin, a shield of pure, incandescent energy that lit up the master suite like a dying star. "You will not touch her," Kade roared, his voice cracking with a fury that shook the very foundations of the spire. The Patriarch didn't even raise a hand. He simply looked at the shield and the silver fire began to flicker. It didn't go out. It turned black. The darkness I felt in my own veins was mirrored in Kade's magic, a corruption that spread like ink in clear water. "You are weak, Kade," the Patriarch said, his voice a calm, clinical observation. "You fight for a girl. I fight for a legacy. You use your magic to protect. I use mine to rule. There is no contest." He raised his hand, and a wave of pure, unadulterated shadow blasted into the room. It wasn't a physical force, it was a psychological one. I felt a crushing weight of despair, 1,000 years of Valen cruelty and ambition pouring into my mind. I saw the faces of the students who had died in the Sanctum, the families who had been destroyed by the Council, the blood that had been spilled to keep the Valen name at the top of the world. "Stop it!" I screamed, my hands flying to my head, my knees buckling. Kade was struggling, his shield crumbling under the pressure of his father's darkness. He was on one knee, his breath coming in ragged, agonizing gasps, his silver eyes dimming as the black ink crawled up his neck. "Take it, Elara!" Kade choked out, his hand reaching back for me. "The bond? Use the bond! Don't let him win!" I reached for the silver thread, the connection that had been our lifeline since the night of the blood oath. But it was different now. It wasn't just a thread, it was a tether, a heavy obsidian chain that pulled at my soul. I grabbed hold of it with both hands, my mind screaming in protest. I didn't just pull on Kade's magic. I pushed mine into him. I sent the black ink, the darkness the Patriarch had given me, back through the bond. "You want power?" I whispered, my voice echoing with a strength that wasn't mine. "Then take it all." The room exploded in a vortex of silver and black light. The Patriarch was thrown back, his iron ring glowing with a sickly jaundiced light as he tried to absorb the shock wave. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something like surprise, or perhaps even fear, in his mercury eyes. Kade stood up, his body glowing with a terrifying, unstable radiance. He wasn't just the air anymore. He was a conduit for everything we had shared. The love, the pain, the rebellion, and the darkness. "Get out!" Kade growled, his voice a physical force that shattered the glass windows of the master suite, sending a rain of shards into the abyss below. "Get out of my school. Get out of my life. Or I will burn the Valen name from the history books myself." The Patriarch stood in the center of the ruined room, his coat torn, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. He looked at Kade, then at me, and then at the black ink on my skin. "You've won the battle, Kade," the Patriarch said, his voice a low, dangerous promise. "But you've already lost the war. You've given her the darkness. You've made her the very thing you hate, and one day she will be the one to destroy you." He stepped back into the shadows, and as the first rays of the sun hit the master suite, he was gone. 6. The aftermath of the storm. The silence that followed was deafening. Kade stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his silver eyes slowly returning to their normal, mercury gray. The glow around him faded, leaving him looking small and fragile against the backdrop of the ruined spire. I walked toward him, my boots crunching on the glass shards. I reached for him, my hand trembling, and this time he didn't flinch. He pulled me into his arms, his heart hammering a frantic, broken rhythm against mine. "Is he gone?" I whispered, my face buried in his chest. "For now," Kade said, his voice a ragged rasp. But he was right, Elara. The darkness, it's in us now. It's part of the bond. He pulled back, his hands cupping my face, his thumb tracing the black lines on my skin. I'm sorry. I tried to save you from this. I tried to keep you clean. I don't want to be clean, Kade, I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. I want to be with you. I want to be the weapon that breaks his world. If this is the price of our freedom, then I'll pay it. Kade looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the boy I had met in the library, the one who was afraid of his own power, the one who just wanted to be seen. But then the mask of the sovereign returned, his jaw setting in a hard, determined line. Then we pay it together, he said. He led me to the edge of the ruined spire, where the glass had been shattered. We looked out over the academy, where the students were still gathered in the courtyard, their faces turned toward the rising sun. They're waiting for us, I said. No, Kade said, his arm tightening around my waist, his voice a low, possessive promise. They're waiting for a new world, and we're the ones who are going to give it to them. He turned me toward him, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. But first, he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that made my skin tingle. We need to finish what we started. We need to make sure the bond is absolute. We need to make sure that no matter what happens, you are mine and I am yours. He leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that tasted of smoke, silver fire, and a love so dark it felt like a vow. The master suite is ours now, Elara, he murmured against my lips. And tonight, the new reign begins. 7. The master suite. After dark. The moon over Arkenfall was a sliver of bone hanging low over the jagged peaks that had once been our prison. Inside the master suite, the air was still, heavy with the scent of cold stone, expensive cedar, and the lingering metallic tang of the silver fire we had unleashed. The shattered glass of the windows had been cleared away by the wind, leaving the room open to the night. The curtains, heavy, midnight blue velvet, snapped and billowed in the mountain breeze like the wings of a great dark bird. Kade stood by the edge of the balcony, his back to me. He had stripped off his torn uniform jacket, leaving him in a thin, white linen shirt that was damp with sweat and stained with the soot of the battle. The fabric clung to the broad muscles of his back, tracing the powerful lines of a man who had just torn a kingdom apart with his bare hand. I watched him from the shadows of the massive four-poster bed. The black marble floor was cold beneath my bare feet, but I didn't feel it. I only felt the thrumming of the bond, the dark obsidian tether that was now permanently etched into my soul. Kade, I whispered, my voice a mere breath in the vast, silent room. He didn't turn immediately. He stayed there staring out at the flickering campfires of the students in the courtyard below. They were celebrating their freedom, but up here, in the silence of the spire, the victory felt hollow. It felt like a beginning, not an end. I think we saved them, Elara, Kade said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. They think the war is over. He turned then, and the moonlight caught the mercury silver of his eyes. They were dark, hooded with an intensity that made my breath hitch. He walked toward me, his movements slow and predatory, his boots silent on the marble. But you and I, we know better, he murmured, stopping just inches from me. The heat radiating from his body was a physical force, a contrast to the biting mountain air. We know that my father is just waiting. We know that the darkness he put in you, it's hungry. He reached out, his fingers, calloused and warm, tracing the line of the black ink on my collarbone. I shivered, a jolt of electricity racing down my spine. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "No," I whispered, leaning into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut. "It feels like power, Kade. It feels like I'm finally awake." He let out a low guttural sound, half growl, half sigh, and pulled me against him. His hands were possessive, sliding down my back to grip my waist, pulling me flush against the hard planes of his chest. "You are the most dangerous thing in this world, Elara Vance." He breathed against my ear, his lips brushing the sensitive skin there. "And you are mine. Do you understand? No matter what my father says, no matter what the High Courts decree, you belong to me." Chapter 8. The Vow of Shadows. He led me to the edge of the bed, his eyes never leaving mine. The room was lit only by the moon and the faint dying glow of the silver fire in the hearth. "I want to see it," Kade murmured, his voice thick with a hunger that made my blood run hot. "I want to see what we've become." He reached for the silk ties of my dress, the same obsidian dress he had given me weeks ago, now torn and stained from the sanctum. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unfastened the silk, letting the fabric pool at my feet. I stood before him in the moonlight, the black ink of the mark tracing intricate, beautiful patterns across my skin. It looked like lace made of shadows, winding around my ribs, over my hips, and down my thighs. Kade's breath hitched. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he traced the path of the darkness. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice wrecked, "terrifying, and perfect." He sat on the edge of the bed, pulling me between his knees. He looked up at me, his silver eyes searching mine, looking for any sign of regret, any sign of the girl who had once been afraid of him. "I gave you this," he said, his voice a low, pained rasp. "I brought this darkness into your life, Elara. I turned you into a weapon." I reached down, my fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling his head against my stomach. "You didn't turn me into anything, Kade. You gave me the strength to be who I was always meant to be. You gave me a choice, and I choose you every time in every life." He let out a broken sound and buried his face in my skin, his breath hot and desperate. "Then stay with me, tonight, tomorrow, until the world burns." "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered, my hand sliding down to cup his face, forcing him to look at me. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming. It was a mixture of love, possessiveness, and a raw, primal need that made my knees weak. He stood up, his hands sliding under my thighs, lifting me as if I weighed nothing. He laid me back against the silk sheets, his body following mine, a heavy, warm weight that anchored me to the world. "The new reign doesn't start with a coronation, Elara," he murmured, his lips hovering just inches from mine. "It starts here, with us, with the bond." He leaned down, his kiss a slow, deep claim that tasted of victory and the dark promise of the future. His hands were everywhere, tracing the lines of the mark, memorizing the curves of my body, claiming every inch of me as his own. The silver fire and the black ink merged between us, a silent, invisible storm that shook the very foundations of the spire. We weren't just two students anymore. We weren't just lovers. We were a single, devastating force, a union of light and dark that the world wasn't prepared for. 9. The morning of the new era. The sun rose over Arkenfall, but it didn't bring the usual sense of peace. The light was cold, illuminating the ruins of the academy and the thousands of students who were now looking to the High Spire for guidance. I woke up in Kade's arms. The silk sheets tangled around our legs. He was still asleep, his face peaceful in the early morning light, the mercury silver of his eyes hidden behind his lashes. I looked down at my arm. The mark was still there, but it had changed. The black ink and the silver fire had merged into a single shimmering pattern, a crown of thorns and stars that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I sat up, pulling the sheet around me, and walked to the balcony. The world looked different from up here. The mountains didn't look like walls anymore. They looked like a challenge. The forest didn't look like a hiding place. It looked like a kingdom. Kade stirred behind me, his hand reaching for the empty space where I had been. He sat up, his hair disheveled, his eyes instantly finding mine. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with sleep and a possessive warmth. "I'm here, Kade," I said, walking back to the bed. He pulled me back into his arms, his chin resting on my shoulder as we both looked out at the horizon. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice a low whisper. "Now," Kade said, his voice gaining a hard, determined edge. "We build. We train. We prepare." He turned me toward him, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "My father is coming back, Elara. The high courts will send their armies. They will try to take back what we've stolen." He reached for my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine, the silver and black light of our bond shimmering in the morning sun. "But they don't know what we are," Kade whispered, his voice a low, dangerous promise. "They don't know that the vacuum has become the vessel, and the vessel is full of fire." 10. The final cliffhanger. The message. A sharp, metallic clink echoed through the room. Kade went still, his eyes darting to the door. I felt the bond spike, a sudden sharp jolt of alarm that made the hair on my arm stand up. "What is it?" I whispered. Kade stood up, his hand reaching for the silver fire that was always hovering just beneath his skin. He walked to the door, his movements silent and lethal. On the floor, just inside the threshold, sat a small black envelope. It was sealed with a heavy, unpolished iron ring, the same ring his father had worn in the Sanctum. Kade picked it up, his jaw setting in a hard line. He opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the single line of elegant, clinical script inside. "What does it say?" I asked, walking toward him, my heart hammering against my ribs. Kade looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something like fear in his mercury eyes. He handed me the paper. The message was simple, written in ink that smelled of old parchment and cold ash. "The transition is complete. I am coming for my queen. Prepare the throne." The paper dissolved into black mist in my hands, leaving only the scent of the Patriarch's malice in the air. Kade pulled me against him, his arm tightening around my waist with a possessive, desperate strength. He looked out at the horizon, where a fleet of dark, winged shapes was appearing against the rising sun. "Let them come," Kade growled, his silver eyes bleeding fire. "Let them all come." I looked at the mark on my wrist, the crown of thorns and stars glowing with a terrifying, incandescent light. The new reign had begun. But the war was just getting started.